Well, hello everyone. It's John Lockland here, speaking to you from Paris this week. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. We're deeply honored to have as our main guest this week Professor Syed Marandi, who joins us from Tehran. Professor, thank you very much for the presentation on geopolitics in generally, world politics, and certainly on the specific question of Iran. I want to start the discussion with a personal anecdote, which is of no great importance in the great scheme of things, but which I think you'll understand why I'm going to tell you. I've only visited your country once. That was in 2004, the year after the invasion of Iraq. And already then, Iran was being lined up by the Bush's administration, supposedly as the next target. And then in 2007, I edited a book with a fellow academic, of which the title was "Next Target Iran?" ? That's 20 years ago for my visit in 2004, and just under 20 years ago for the book in 2007. We've been in this situation for decades, haven't we, Professor Marandi, where Iran is being threatened. The noises coming out of the Trump administration are nothing new.
Absolutely.
Professor Marandi.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's actually the starting point when the Iranians seriously began to prepare themselves for a possible strike by the Americans or an invasion even back then. Iran was surrounded on all sides, literally. I'm sure you recall Russia was very weak. The United States was making inroads into Central Asia. In fact, in order to maintain their control over Afghanistan, they had established bases in Central Asia, and they had huge influence in the Caucasus. They occupied Iraq, Afghanistan. Now that I think about it, it was pretty bad. And they also were in control of the Persian Gulf, as they continue to be in these small Arab family dictatorships. So I think it's fair to say that since 2003, a bit before you traveled to Iran, the country was seriously contemplating the possibility of an attack by the United States and an invasion. They had the troops both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they had the bases all around the country. At that time, the United States was, as someone once called it, a hyperpower, and China was still in the early stages of its rise. Russia was just beginning to revive itself, and Iran was still suffering from the consequences of the Western-backed war that Saddam Hussein imposed on the country, where the West gave him everything, including chemical weapons to use against the Iranians and his own people. So for the last 20 years, at least, the Iranians have been preparing themselves. They've been investing, especially in high-tech capabilities. Most importantly, as we all know today, in the missile and drone areas. In these fields, they've been making considerable advances, as I think many in Russia would point out. And especially since Iran was sanctioned. The sanctions did not begin with the Obama maximum pressure sanctions. They began much earlier, and they included the military sanctions against Iran's military. So Iran began to develop its own military industry, which included building helicopters and tanks, naval ships. But most importantly, I think Iran heavily invested in inexpensive and effective weapons like drones and missiles. And right now, Iran has, I think, at least 300 underground missile bases spread out across the country, with literally hundreds of thousands of drones and missiles that are ready to use in case of any assault on the country or in case of any attack. Of course, the situation today is very different. The United States has been forced to leave Iraq. I think Iran had very much to do with that. They were forced to leave Afghanistan. Iran had very much to do with that. General Soleimani, I think it's fair to say, played a huge role in both of these arenas. And the United States, its general decline of influence in Central Asia and the Caucasus to a lesser degree is a fact. And so right now, the basic threat from the United States, or at least over the last 10 years, has been focused on the Persian Gulf. And if you go back to WikiLeaks documents, you'll see that some of these leaders in the Persian Gulf, they were calling for strikes against Iran. Cut off the head of the snake, as one crown prince or later king put it. But today, I think even the Persian Gulf is not really a threat. We saw King Salman's of Saudi Arabia, his son, the defense minister, come to Tehran with a very positive message. And it's clear that the family regimes in the Persian Gulf do not want war, because they know that if there is war, that their regimes won't last. So the U.S. threat to Iran, which exists, really is limited in scope. A ground invasion, I think, is impossible. The United States does not have the manpower or the money to bring in 1.5 million people. It doesn't have anywhere to station them. The only thing left is for airstrikes. That would be either from Diego Garcia, which would be a 5,000-kilometer flight to Tehran, and they'd have to have the B-2s and B-52s would have to have support aircraft, which will be a big problem. Or they'd have to, or it'd be like what the Israeli regime does, and that is fly over Iraq. But if they do that, then the American assets in Iraq would be very vulnerable. Firing, and then
Professor
yes,
Marandi,
just one sentence to point out is, and that is that if the Americans want to have even effective airstrikes, and we have to keep in mind that Russia and Ukraine have been fighting for well over 3 years, and a few airstrikes is not really all that much. But if the United States wants to have effective airstrikes, they'd have to fly over Iran. And the Israelis never dared to come any closer than roughly 100 kilometers from Iran's border. Sorry, Peter.
No problem. We always learn from you. You just said that it was an excellent chronology getting us up to the present. Maximum pressure is not something new under Donald Trump, obviously. But the Trump administration, suddenly there's this emergency. It's an emergency again. You made it very clear that the Gulf family monarchies, they're not interested in any kind of conflict. Russia certainly isn't. And part of your chronology we could add is the growing close relationship between Russia and Iran's relationship with China as well. It's very important here. So I'm going to ask you a question that self-answers itself, but I think it's important for our viewers to understand where we are right now. So I don't see any takers for war in that region except for the United States and Israel. Isn't that odd?
Yes, it is quite odd, isn't it? And I think that one thing that we have to take note of is that the United States and all these think tanks, the think tanks are pro-Trump, anti-Trump, Republican, Democrat. They've been saying that Iran is weak, Iran is vulnerable, Iran is a paper tiger. But just yesterday, we saw some interesting news come out of the White House. And it was basically, while Trump was calling it the capitulation of Yemen and Ansarullah, I think it's fair to say that the White House capitulated in the Red Sea. And of course, since it's Trump, he could always flip-flop and start another war tomorrow. That's just how it works with him. But the United States did capitulate, and it shows that the United States really doesn't have the sort of power that they claim to have. The U.S. Secretary of Defense and was speaking about what he's going to do to the so-called Houthis, or more appropriately, Ansarullah, but didn't turn out too well.
Well, could I come back to you on that, because we've heard with other guests speaking on Iran this a similar argument, and I have a great deal of sympathy for it. But could I put to you the opposite position, which is that Iran's main enemy, which is Israel, is winning one victory after another. They decapitated Hezbollah. You mentioned General Soleimani several years ago. They decapitated Hezbollah last year. They've overthrown the regime in Syria. They've invaded Lebanon. They are pursuing their land grab in Gaza. Nothing is stopping them. Might people listening to you not think that there is complacency on the Iranian side?
Yes, we've heard that argument quite a lot, and I think there's a lot that can be said about it. The Israelis haven't been able to take Gaza despite the genocide for 19 months now. And Gaza is just a tiny piece of land. If I'm sure you recall, in 1982, when the Israelis invaded Lebanon, they reached the capital in 5 days, 4 or 5 days. When they waged war against Arab countries, they went all the way across the Sinai and defeated the Egyptian army, but they are still stuck in Gaza. In Lebanon, they murdered senior officials. The leader of Hezbollah was martyred, and senior commanders were martyred. But Hezbollah remained steadfast. The Israelis failed to make any inroads during the battles in Lebanon, any significant inroads. And it was the Israelis that sought a ceasefire. In Gaza, the Israelis are not the ones pushing for a ceasefire, but in Lebanon, they were the ones who pushed for a ceasefire. The only place where militarily one could say that the Israelis had an achievement, in my opinion, was in Syria. And that was, of course, a conspiracy that began in 2011, something that Peter Lavelle and I and others have been discussing for, I think, 14 years now on his show, and that the dirty war in Syria, which we later found out was called Operation Timber Sycamore, that was the intention from the very beginning, was to bring down Syria for the sake of the Israeli regime. It was something that the Israelis wanted. However, I think that ultimately, and we could go over Syria and the history of Syria and what happened and how we got to where we are now. But I think, as I may have said before on George and Peter's show, and I may be wrong, but I said back then that after the fall of Syria, that I think that it's not going to turn out well for those who actually won the war or who took over Syria. A conspiracy between Erdogan, Netanyahu, and Biden ultimately led to the collapse of the government. But right now, the burden of Syria is no longer on Iran's shoulders. Iran and Russia were paying a lot of money to sustain the Syrian state. Iran was basically paying for all of the cars on the streets of across Syria through oil and gasoline. So the burden is no longer on Iran's shoulders, and we now see the situation in Syria to be far worse than what it was during the Assad presidency, despite it being liberated, as we've been repeatedly told. The situation is terrible for minorities. The situation is terrible for ordinary people. Food prices are through the roof. There are no jobs. And despite all the promises made by Qatar and Erdogan and others, the situation there's no sign of it improving. And the West has not removed the sanctions. All those promises that we heard that once Assad is gone, it's going to turn into, I don't know, Dubai or Paris or, well, whatever Paris is these days.
Well, I mean, Professor Marandi, one of the demands coming out of the current White House is, there's a whole list of them, but then a few of them really stick out is they have to normalize relations with Israel, maybe some sanction relief. Then, I mean, that, they show their cards. Okay. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, and that actually, Peter, that's, I think, that's another thing that has actually hurt the Israelis, because all those people who've been criticizing the resistance all these years for supporting Assad, now many of them have recognized what has happened, and that has consolidated the position of the resistance across the region. It has, because there was a huge campaign against the axis of resistance in Iran for well over a decade, saying that they're slaughtering the people of Syria and they're supporting this dictatorship. And now they see the reality that this new regime that they were supporting, that they thought would bring freedom to Syria, it's literally on its knees begging for better relations with the West, preparing itself for accepting the Israeli regime, and carrying out sectarian slaughter against all the different minorities, and including ordinary Sunnis as well, and Sufi Sunnis in particular. So, and this going back to Lebanon, this has put Hezbollah in a very powerful position, because those who are saying that Hezbollah should disarm, when they look at Syria, they see, oh, this armament basically leaves the gate open for the Israelis to destroy the country. The destruction of Syria after the fall of Assad was far worse than anything that we saw before. The Israelis have destroyed the country's infrastructure, and they've occupied key parts of the country. But also, in addition to that, not only does it consolidate, and by the way, I don't know if you've been following the local elections in Lebanon. Hezbollah, in all the areas which it contested, they took everything. They won all the seats, they and their allies. And that shows that people in Lebanon recognize the role that Hezbollah plays. They recognize that Hezbollah has been protecting the country. And when they look at what happened in Syria, not just the people of Lebanon, not just the people of Syria, but many of those people who, as I said, were supporting this dirty war in Syria, they've woken up to reality. Not everyone. Some people are, deeply tied up in their sectarian hatreds and their prejudices, or their support for Western policies. Many of them get funding from oil and gas-rich dictatorships. You can buy intellectuals at a pretty good price nowadays, as we've seen. But I think for the most part, people, those who are sincere, they're now seeing reality. They see that Erdogan is not supporting the Palestinian cause. He's done nothing but actually support Netanyahu. So all of this has consolidated the resistance, the axis of resistance. And then what has happened to the Israelis? They've destroyed their image. They became hated across the world. I've just returned from China. I went to Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and the attitudes towards Israel from all my experiences, and from what people who I've met were saying about what they see online and what they see on campus and elsewhere, the attitudes towards the Israeli regime are very negative, and this is completely different from what it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, people didn't even think about the region. Most people didn't even know that there was what was going on, and those who did know a thing or two, they thought there was some sort of fight over a piece of land between the Israelis and Arabs. But now there's a great deal of awareness. So I think the biggest defeat for the regime and for the West, for the collective West,
I agree.
has been the destruction of their image in the eyes of the world. Just,
and
the United States.
It's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse.
Right. Could I just
It's going to get further entrenched.
Go ahead,
could I just
George.
I want to ask, because I don't know the answer to the question, because yesterday's announcement by Trump was really very interesting. He caught the Israelis unawares. He didn't let Israel know about his announcement. He did it on the same day that Israel was actually pummeling Yemen. And the indications are that Steve Witkoff was again instrumental in this negotiations with the Houthis. The agreement, that to the extent that we can exactly understand this agreement, the agreement only relates to attacks on American shipping. Doesn't apply at all to Israeli shipping. So when you look at that and say, and there's talk that there's going to be another round of negotiations over nuclear denuclearization with Iran this weekend, again involving Witkoff. The suggestion to me is that Trump is basically, letting Israel go, letting Israel say, you do your thing. We're not going to be backing you anymore. We're not going to be fighting your wars for you. And that follows on from noises that have been coming from the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party. There was the very lengthy tweet sent out by Marjorie Taylor Greene, a fervent Trump loyalist, saying we have to stop fighting other countries' wars, particularly countries that themselves have nuclear weapons. Steve Bannon said the same thing. We're not going to fight Netanyahu's wars. So what Trump did by making this announcement, and really Israel knew nothing about this, he seems to be, pulling the plug on Israel, at least for the time being. What's your take of that?
Well, pulling the plug, I think, would be it would
Too strong.
It's too strong. Exactly. I think that when it comes to Yemen, what you say is accurate. I do believe, and this is just a guess, I don't have any information. Maybe the three of you could add to something to this, but I think that not only has the United States been defeated in the Red Sea, losing 3 F-18s, losing more than 20 very expensive drones, each costing 30 to 40 million dollars, apparently, if they have weapons and all the instruments on them. And of course, all sorts of ammunition and all of these flights cost a lot. And the flights were all from the north of the Red Sea because the aircraft carrier has to be very far away to be better protected from drones and missiles. So all of the bomb strikes, the airstrikes, they're very expensive to carry out. But I also think that militarily it was a failure. They were unable to destroy any of Ansarullah's underground facilities. They simply murdered innocent people. But I think it also may have something to do with Trump's trip to the region. Trump does not want to see missiles flying around Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or in Qatar while he's traveling, or in so that I think is a part of it. And also, George, and you know this better than I, we could wake up tomorrow morning, although we're in different time zones, but we can wake up tomorrow and see on Truth Social Trump declare another war on Yemen. That's Trump. There's no way to.
There's one thing that's kind of interesting, and George and I have talked about this, and we need more data points, but it seems, or it's a plausible argument, I think, one could make, is that Trump's attitude is, when it comes to the Palestinians, when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to the West Bank, if you want to throw in Yemen, that's your business. That's where the confines are. Other than that, this is your backyard, your front porch, is horrendous as this sounds. That it seems to me that's what Trump is saying. That's whatever you do, that's your business. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. When it comes to Iran, that's our business. Okay. Now, is morally reprehensible as that it is, it seems to be that's the case, because he almost never demurs on what's going on in Gaza or the West Bank, because that's not my problem. It's someone else's problem. Is that plausible to you?
That is true, but there is the case of the ceasefire in Gaza, which Witkoff negotiated, and I think for whatever reason, Trump wanted it to happen before he became president, and it literally did happen the day before he assumed presidency. But the really stunning thing about it is that Trump, and I don't know if Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize or not. I don't know what goes on in his mind, because
I think he
some
does.
people,
I think he does.
I imagine that to be the case because he's said this sort of thing multiple times before. But in any case, it did give him some credit as a
Yes.
peacemaker, even though I would not call him that, but it did give him some credibility. And what did he do? Literally days later, he called for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And this was his own deal. It wasn't someone else's deal. We were told that Witkoff, went on Saturday afternoon and read the riot act to Netanyahu and forced the deal down his throat. And it was going to be in 3 phases, and we all know what happened next. So the problem here is that it did seem to be important for him, for whatever reason, credibility. I don't think it was too much of a humanitarian issue, because later on he greenlighted the restart of the genocide. But it does have consequences whether he recognizes it or not, that go beyond Gaza and beyond the humanitarian issue and the bloodshed. And that is that the Iranians, when they look at Gaza, they say, okay, well, then Trump does not abide by his own deals either. So when he was president first time round, he tore up Obama's deal, the JCPOA. And he said, this is the worst deal ever. But when he was behind the Witkoff deal, he tore up that too. And so for the Iranians, the question is, in my opinion, is that let's assume that we're able to come to some sort of deal with Trump, which is not clear if it's really possible because of all the flip-flops. We saw it with regards to the trade war. We see it in Ukraine. Trump is effectively turning into another Biden. He could have ended the war on day one. He could have said, look, this is not my war, as he likes to say, even though he was deeply involved in creating the Ukrainian army. But he could have said, it's not my war and I'm going to end it. And he would have, because of the momentum that he had, he could have done it and it would have been over. But he delayed and he flip-flopped, and now he's beginning to look more like Kellogg and sound more and more like Kellogg. So
yeah, I did a recording yesterday. It was called Trump's Forever War.
But exactly. So when you look at what happened in Gaza, he violated his own deal, and all these flip-flops. The question for the Iranians is, okay, if we have a deal, how do we know he's not going to tear it apart, or tear it up? As I was telling George earlier, we could wake up and see on Truth Social, he says, I don't like this deal, it's finished. B, how do we get to a deal? Because he's constantly flip-flopping on all these issues, trade, Ukraine, the region. I don't want to go into internal US politics. So it's becoming really almost impossible, I think, well, I can't say impossible, but it's very difficult, I would assume, and I'm not involved at all in the negotiations. I have no idea what's happening, but I would assume it would be very difficult to negotiate anything, because just as a hypothetical, I'm clueless about the negotiation. Even when I was 3 years ago, when I was in Vienna as a media advisor, and 10 years ago when I was with Dr. Zarif too as his media advisor, I stayed away from the negotiations. I did not want to know anything. I was just going to do media. I was on Peter's show from Vienna a number of times.
Yeah.
But the point is, let's say that, for the sake, hypothetically, Iran wants to agree to stop doing something, and by stopping it, it would, let's say, be very difficult to restart that part of the nuclear program, or it would be costly, right? So sometimes you just you turn something on and turn it off. There's no problem. Some things, if you want to turn it off, or it's costly, and it's time consuming. So what if Iran agrees to do something that's costly, and then Trump the next day he tears up the deal? So Iran will pay a price and gain nothing in return. So what you're saying, Peter, is absolutely true. Although I would say that he did try to get involved in Gaza, but he apparently just threw it out the window, whatever the objectives were. But it also has implications that go to issues that have nothing to do with, or at least nothing directly to do with Gaza and the Palestinians in Gaza.
So does that
But
mean
at the
then,
same time,
what do we? No, go ahead, George.
No, I
Go
was just
ahead,
going to
George.
follow up on what you said. But the negotiations are still ongoing, and at least from the Iranian side, they have consistently sounded quite positive. They said, "Well, you know, we're making progress," and because I mean, the way you describe it, then what is the point even of any kind of negotiation? So they're obviously making some progress. I mean, there was a report, I think, in the Times of Israel a few days ago, a very detailed breakdown of what the issues are, and it's quite technical. And there seems to be the basis for some kind of a deal here. It wouldn't involve the complete dismantlement of Iran's civilian nuclear program. It'll be maybe enrichment at a lower level and the JCPOA, fewer centrifuges. That's at least from this report, they're getting into the details. So, I mean, obviously, at least the fact that talks are ongoing means Iran's leaders do think that there's some purpose in continuing with this dialogue.
Well, there are a number of things here. One is that, in general, negotiations, I think, are something that the Iranians will always engage in, even though these negotiations are indirect, and they're indirect for a purpose. The Iranians, for the last few years, have no longer been negotiating with the Americans directly. Under Biden, they negotiated indirectly, and it was a means by the Iranians to put pressure on the Americans. If the Americans want to talk directly, then they have to show that they're sincere, and after they show they're sincere, the Iranians will agree to direct talks. And Trump has insisted on direct talks. Iran refused, and ultimately there remained indirect talks. Trump wanted them to be in the Emirates. Iran insisted they be in Oman. These are small issues, but they are symbolically important. They carry weight at the negotiating table. But the Iranians are not going ever. The Iranians will never leave the negotiating table, because for two reasons. One is that there's always, as you were saying, there could be an agreement. If there's a potential for a decent agreement for Iran, then why leave? But there's also the possibility that the talks will fail. And if the talks fail, the Iranians don't want to be seen as the side that's caused the problem. Nowadays, especially, Iran has much more soft power than it had a couple of years ago. The United States, for a host of reasons that we don't need to get into, but Gaza, the trade war, Ukraine, and Trump himself, this has weakened U.S. status across the globe. And so it's much easier for Iran to make the United States look guilty than it would have been 10 years ago, because the media was, the Western media ruled the world. And so back then, whatever happened, Iran would have been blamed. Now it's very different. So even if there isn't an agreement, the Iranians would be able to have the blame, would be able to have many people recognize that the blame lies on American shoulders. So whether there's a deal or not a deal, it's beneficial for the Iranians to stay at the negotiating table and to be positive. I would be positive if I was a negotiator, regardless of what's going on at the table, unless the talks fall apart. Because I don't want to be seen as the side that's saying, "Oh, this is not going well. We're having problems." You want the other side to start nagging about it. But there are also other issues too, and that is that Witkoff, he is supposedly the more sensible person, in the administration. I think all of us would probably agree that he seems to be the most sane of them all, which is not saying much, but still, he seems to be more sane than the rest. But before the show, Peter was laughing about a tweet, I think that's what you were alluding to, by the Secretary of Defense, threatening Iran, saying we're going to hit you. Witkoff retweeted that. And so that insane tweet was retweeted by the most sane person in the Trump team. I'm not saying we can read everything into that, but it does show that if you're an Iranian negotiator, I would assume, and I'm not involved in the negotiations at all. I would assume that would raise serious questions about where's all this going, and where do the Americans want to take this? And it's not just Trump flip-flopping. Just like in Ukraine, you see Kellogg. It's as if he's from one universe, and then Trump's in some other universe, and then Witkoff from a third universe. Really, when Kellogg talks, you think like this is like 2024, and Biden has appointed him as his representative. So you have all these differing voices, and I think Trump or his people like to say that strategic uncertainty, or but
ambiguity.
It's not.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think someone in the team called it uncertainty, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's from his book, like The Art of the Deal, or something. But yeah, in reality it's strategic ambiguity. But the point is that from where I look at things, it looks like chaos more than it looks like strategic anything, or whether uncertainty or ambiguity. And the point is that even if it is strategic uncertainty or ambiguity, if the receiving end does not see it that way, then that's not what it is. And to me and to many others, what's coming out of Washington looks more like chaos, or at least very chaotic. But there is still potential for a deal. I'm not saying it won't happen. I mean, right now we saw Trump literally capitulate in Yemen. In Yemen, basically what happened in Yemen is that Trump decided to wipe out Ansarullah, or what they called the Houthis in the West. He decided to wipe them out and get rid of them once and for all, and then he couldn't. And so what happened? We're now back to the day before when Trump started his war on Ansarullah, and that means the days when Ansarullah blocked the Red Sea to Israeli ships, as long as they were massacring people in Gaza. Because the reason why Ansarullah restarted the siege on the Israeli regime was when Netanyahu began the starvation siege. They threatened him. I think they gave him 4 days. He ignored them, and they imposed the siege in the Red Sea. The Americans and the British, when they started attacking Ansarullah, that's what led to the Red Sea being shut down. Not because Ansarullah was bombing ordinary ships, but because insurance companies put up rates so high that no ship would go through the Red Sea anymore, except for maybe some small vessels that were willing to risk it. But big ships would have to go all the way around around Africa. So what Trump has done is he's basically put us where we were less than 2 months ago.
John, do you want?
Okay, well,
I think what this is, listening to you, Professor Marandi, I'm reminded of listening to Sergei Lavrov and the sort of things that he says about negotiations, of course, and Putin as well, for that matter. They say, well, for instance, with respect to Zelensky, they say, well, how can we negotiate with him? He might not be in power tomorrow. He's probably illegitimate, etc. You've made a similar point with referring to the flip-flops, and I wonder what we all think collectively. You've talked about chaos, and that's definitely how it seems. I was felt relatively positive about Trump's victory, but as the days go on and the weeks go on, one gets more and more disillusioned. When the in the early let's say weeks of the Trump administration, when we all thought, hooray, he's going to put an end to the war in Ukraine. Some people commented that that was because the Americans had simply looked at the reality and realized that they were losing. They'd thrown everything in the kitchen sink into Ukraine and it wasn't working. But what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, Professor Marandi, is that it's not even reality that's dawning. For example, in the Iranian case, you've made the point in other interviews that the Americans simply can't substantially attack Iraq. That they just can't. You've said this. I think you may have said it just now. You've said it in other interviews. So, what do we think?
I meant as an invasion.
Yes, but also because of the distance from Diego Garcia and so on, and not being able to fly.
It would be costly. It would be difficult.
Yeah,
the effectiveness would be limited. Yeah.
But do we think then collectively that the Americans understand that, as they perhaps understand that they're losing in Ukraine, or is it again just as you say, chaos, ideology, megalomania, and illusion in Washington?
I think it's the second more than the first. Peter and I have a good friend, Alistair Crook, who's actually right now in Tehran. I remember when I was young, like 16, 17 years ago, I was at one of his conferences, seminars in Beirut. And we were having this discussion over coffee about some US policy. And I was saying, well, Alistair, being the younger guy, the much younger person that I am now, I said, but Alistair, this really is not good for US. This is not in US interests, and the United States this doesn't seem to be rational. And he said to me, Mohammad, always you think that this decision-making process in the West is based on rationality and reason. It's not. It's based on emotions. A few months later, I was again invited to one of his conferences, and I think we were having coffee together and having discussions. And I raised another one. I said something similar about something else. And having the good memory that he has, he said, Mohammed, remember what I told you last time? And you're saying that these are highly emotional. And I think that is very much the case. I'm not saying it's all completely emotional. But I think that the hostility towards Iran, and towards Russia, is very emotional. It is racist. I remember when the war in Ukraine began. The Wall Street Journal had a picture of President Putin, on the cover. And it said, I don't remember the phrase, I wish I did, but it said that Russia's returning to its Asian roots, something like that. And President Putin was wearing a Mongolian military uniform. So, in other words, these Russians who I've traveled, I don't know Russia like Peter, but I've traveled to Russia quite often, and they look pretty white to me. Many of these Russians
and not very barbaric, I would say.
Well, I've been to East Asia, and they look very civilized to me too. But the point is that he did not look like the Mongolians that we watched in these old movies when they were in. But the point is, they were using a racist trope. They were saying that this guy is not really European, and that the reason why he's so aggressive and nasty and horrible and so on is because of his Mongolian DNA. That's basically what was being. And I would advise, I would encourage your viewers right now to use any search engine and just look for this Wall Street Journal, President Putin, war in Ukraine. They'll find it among the images. It comes up really quickly. But in any case, the same is true with Iran. So I do think so. In the West, I believe, in the United States too, but in Europe as well, I think that Eurocentrism and American exceptionalism is still blinding elites to reality. For us, it's obvious that the empire is on the decline. I I don't know if you've ever been to Chongqing or to Chengdu in China. These two cities, Chongqing has 30, it's the largest city in the world, population-wise. 31 million, I think. Chengdu has 21 million. To be very honest with you, until a few years ago, I didn't even know that there were these two cities existed. Even though I've been to China, and I never even knew. Someone said, "Oh, you want to go to Chongqing?" I said, I didn't have any clue what. These two cities are over 50 million people, and they're close to each other. If you just go there, you'd be stunned how these cities that I had not heard of until, in my ignorance, until just a few years ago, how decades ahead of Europe and North America they are. And I'm not talking about Shanghai, and I'm not talking about Shenzhen. I'm talking about two cities that I had not heard of before. So but the West, or the elites in the West, are blind to this reality. Remember, Russia was, what was it, a gas station posing as a country, as Obama once said. I'm paraphrasing, of course. The United States and the West looks down at the rest of the world. And of course, Iran is, it's a regime. It's despised. It's the mullahs, and it's falling apart, and they're incompetent, and they're corrupt, and everyone hates them.
You're talking about Russia or Iran?
Yes, and or it could be anyone. But the paradox is, at the same time, and sometimes in the same breath, they say that it's a rising menace. It's a threat, not just to the region, to the world. How could this collapsing, incompetent regime, this jalopy that's about to fall apart, be so effective and powerful, and be prepared for a Formula One race?
I always say it's 007 or Keystone Cops. Which one is it?
Which one is it?
I'd like to ask you a question. I'm kind of going back a little bit what George was saying. We have in Lebanon, Hezbollah took a terrible beating. It's still there, and you've updated us on what's going on there. The Assad government is gone. We have balkanization of one form or another going on. The attempted regime change in Yemen, and this whole beeper thing on attacking Hezbollah and countless numbers of civilians as a war crime. It seems to me that there is an amalgamation of going on with these talks, the nuclear talks, which I don't think it's about that at all. I think it's about regime change. It's regime change. And the Americans can never say yes. And if they do say yes, they don't keep their word. Okay. Donald Trump didn't keep Obama's word. And the sanctions never really came down either under Obama's plan. It seems to me that this is a song and dance. It's very elaborate. Nobody in the West doesn't want to be held responsible. We tried, Trump went that extra mile, he crossed the DMZ, but no, at the end of the day, it's regime change. It has nothing to do about Iran's nuclear ambitions at the end of the day. Is that a fair assessment?
Let me give you tell you a short story that has nothing to do with this, but you raised North Korea, and I thought it would be interesting. I said this somewhere else. Maybe I said it to you. If I have, I apologize. I think Dr. Zarif told me this story, but maybe I'm wrong. When after Trump went to speak, when the U.S. president and the leader of North Korea met, the Iranians obviously were very interested because they wanted to see what it was like. So when the North Korean foreign minister came to Iran, I think probably the Iranian foreign minister or some other officials asked him, what was Trump like? And he said, I think it was the foreign minister, the North Korean foreign minister, he said it was really good. It was a good meeting, and it was fine. But as soon as he left the room, meaning Trump, everything just immediately fell apart. Why? Because Bolton and the gang, they immediately went back to business as usual. And the U.S. Secretary of State at that time, what's his name? The former head of, we lie, we cheat, we steal.
Mike Pompeo.
Pompeo.
Pompeo. He and Bolton, immediately demolished the negotiations. Immediately. Well, not like 2 hours later. Immediately they demolished it. So it's not directly linked, but it is interesting how the people around Trump can change things. It's a completely different team now. The very fact that they could do that, I think, was very, very revealing. With regards to the intention of the United States, I agree completely. This has nothing to do with the Iranian nuclear program. This has nothing to do with all this stuff about human rights. I mean, the only, all your friends are right now in Tehran. We have mutual friends here. When they leave, you can ask them what Tehran was like. In Iran, we have open people who hate the government. They hate the regime. You have for every if for every 100 Iranians, you have 100 different views. And my classes are like that. Discussion. Iran is not Saudi Arabia or any of these other countries. But so when they say when they talk about human rights, it's not about human rights. It's not about terrorism. It's not about the nuclear program. It is about, of course, the military-industrial complex and all that, and the United States always needing an enemy. That's true also. But it's about Israel. It's about the Israeli regime. It's about the Israeli regime and needing regime to be dominant and the influence that the regime has in Washington. Otherwise, if you remove the Israeli regime from the equation, if there was no Israel, the relations between West Asia, North Africa, and Europe and the United States would be completely different from what they are today. And the Iran-US relations would be the opposite of what they are today. In fact, what I would argue is that Israel, regardless of what it was 40, 50 years ago, which is debatable, it is not an asset. It is a burden to the United States. It is a burden to the collective West. The West is paying a heavy price for the regime and for its very existence.
But this goes back to what we started with. I mean, that announcement by Trump yesterday was pretty much saying, Israel, you're on your own. This deal is between us, the United States, and the Houthis. They're free to go on hitting any Israeli assets. They can go on hitting Ben Gurion Airport or whatever. That's got nothing to do with us. We have a deal. You're not going to attack American ships. That plus Trump's telling Netanyahu twice. Netanyahu went twice to Washington, wanting to get America to bomb Iran. Trump telling him twice, no, we're not going to do it, would indicate, at least there's a signs that Trump at least realizes that we are America. I'm the president of the United States. I'm not the president of Israel. I'm not in the business of fighting Israel's wars. Now,
it's a trap. He realizes it's a trap.
It's a trap. And so what you were saying, and I absolutely agree with that there's no reason whatsoever for bad relations between Iran and the United States. Maybe, just maybe, that is becoming, the Trump administration is becoming aware of this. There are no more Pompeos. Pompeo's not there. Bolton is not there. Trump runs the foreign policy now of the United States. He didn't during his first term. The people who are close to him are not warmongers. His son, Don Jr., he's not a warmonger. J.D. Vance, he's not a warmonger. Tucker Carlson, he's influential. Steve Bannon.
Owens.
It may be. I mean, I'm just putting it out there. You may disagree, but I'm just putting out that maybe there might be some positive development in U.S.-Iran relations.
But going back to our thesis, which I think is important in addressing your proposition, is that all of the people that you mentioned around Trump, they're ardent Zionists as well, okay? Where they will protect Israel, what they think is greater Israel, but that doesn't include Iran, that doesn't include Yemen.
Yeah, that's Palestine. Yeah, go on.
I agree with you, George, but Peter is right too. He's correct. That's the problem. But more than that is the very fact that Trump has changed his position on everything so much. I mean, I did not think that there would be peace in Ukraine after Trump came to power. I was skeptical. I thought that the war would continue. However, I didn't think that Trump would sign off to more weapons to Ukraine. And true, these are weapons that were the previous, the Biden team or the Biden regime, they were behind it. But still, I didn't think he'd go that far after all he'd said, but he did. And and the language used by Kellogg really, I mean, I think for the four of us who pursue these issues and are more interested than a lot of other people who have do other things, he sounds ridiculous. He sounds like he's as I said earlier, in a different universe. But he's still there, and Trump won't remove him. And you're right about the people not being Bolton and not being the sort of. I mean, Bolton was a powerful figure of sorts. He was very influential, and these are mostly yes men. But at the end of the day, many of them are Israeli first serves, and there is some resistance. I agree. There is some resistance being put up in Congress and by influential media people around Trump, like Tucker Carlson. But still, the forces be. I cannot. If you ask me, do you think there will be some sort of military conflict with the United States or between Iran and the United States? And if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I wouldn't be able to put money on anything because I don't know. I can't say. I can't say what the chances are. What I can say is that if there is military conflict between Iran and the United States, I have no doubt that the United States will lose. I have no doubt about that. There's not a 1% chance. And I think what happened in Yemen should be a lesson learned for Trump and for the people around Trump, because the trouble that they had in Yemen, it is nothing compared to what will happen if they have any sort of military conflict with Iran. But the arrogance of power led them to try attacking Yemen, and they failed. Who knows whether the arrogance of power will play a role in the decision-making process about whether to engage with Iran and come to a decent deal, or to move towards military confrontation.
Well, it's very interesting that you should conclude on the Yemeni case. I've wanted us to devote an issue of the forum for some time to Yemen. So let's set that out as an ambition. And you're quite right. If they can't defeat Ansar Allah, then they're going to have a hell of a job defeating Iran. Mohammad Marandi, it's been absolutely delight listening to you and a great honor. So thank you very much indeed for giving us your time. And thank you to my two co-hosts, Peter Lavelle and George Samueli. We're very grateful to you, and I'm sure our viewers are too. All the best. Thank you, everyone. See you again next week. Bye.
Thank you.